Hello everyone, we finally made it. We're at the movie era, if you can tell by the little intro that I whipped up for you there. So, here we are at last. We got through, I didn't go through everything before movies, but if you watch my previous videos, I hit all the highlights. I hit all the stuff that led up to, you know, what we're about to talk about. There's tons of more stories that I could have talked about, more short stories and so on. The vampire, Varney, Carmilla, and Dracula. Those are the big four that influenced a lot of the stuff that came after, but they're by no means all there was. So, maybe sometime in the future I might go back and talk about other stories. But to get to here, I just wanted to talk about, the stuff that got us to here. Left off with Dracula, and, like I said, Dracula was kind of was a big hit. It was sort of a, best of the vampire story and, undead stories and ghost stories and supernatural stories, all that sort of stuff. The hodgepodge of so many different ideas that came from the past, and so it became Dracula. It came out in the late, in the 1890s, and also in the 1890s was the advent of the movies. So sort of coincided together, and as movies started to come out. It's an interesting story. At least I find it interesting anyway. Some of you might be like, get on with it. But just bear with me for a minute here. The early part of the movies of cinema, you had things like they used to call actualies, where basically just be people filming stuff, because people, there was no internet back then. There weren't even airplanes back then. When the travel was by boat or by train, and going to another country for most people was out of the question. So I don't know why. I've noticed in my other videos watching back, I don't know why I scratch my nose so much. I apologize if that gets on anyone's nerves. I have no idea. Maybe it's just a nervous tick because I'm not as comfortable as I should be yet talking to a camera. It's just still weird for me. So it might just be an unconscious thing. I don't even realize I'm doing it half the time, so I apologize. Anybody's caught me doing that a bunch. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, so the actualities. So people would travel to different places, like Africa and, more exotic places that most people would never see. Somebody, if I was living back then, here I am in, freezing cold New England for most of the year. And, I wouldn't know what a, tiger looked like or anything like that back then. In 1899, for example. Never mind 1910. For example, even years later, like that. So they would put stuff like that in movies, or be more vaudeville shows back then. More traveling, be part of a, kind of a circus act, if you will. Sure, most of you know what vaudeville was. So, be part of that, where just being a special attraction thing. Somebody would see something. I mean, you hear the stories of the old days where they would go places and it would be a shot of a train, on screen, and people would just run out, thinking the train's going to come through the screen and run them all over. And so that's how all new that that was. And it wasn't a little while later until people started to, I just want to finish that thought for a second there with the old school down there. Because I have so much I want to talk about, so I'm just so like, okay, don't forget this, don't forget that, and starting to already forget stuff. So back then they would have, news stuff, newsreels. That's how people would kind of, aside from newspapers, would, even see what their president looked like half the time and stuff like that. And it's kind of funny when you look back on it. Early cinema, in a lot of ways, was sort of like YouTube now to an extent. It was just, people going out with cameras and just filming stuff as it happened, or, giving political, taking political video and putting it, in theaters or and such, Nickelodeons. And just, that was how information got out to people. So, sometime later, people, got the idea that the camera was a way of telling stories, up to revolutionary. Before that, all you had was, books, and you had plays. That was how you made a story and put it out to the public. So now you got this whole new medium, and it wasn't long before people started doing just that. But it wasn't until mid, 19 teens that we started getting the first feature-length films. First, there were just shorts. The most famous was probably the, what the hell is it called? I'm blanking the name. From the Earth to the Moon. But even that one, if I recall, is maybe like 10 minutes long or something like that. So anything that was like an hour sometime before then. But then we get to the 1920s, and finally somebody got around to making vampire movies. Took them long enough. Now, here's a little fun fact, what I'm going to spend the first part of this video talking about. You may have gotten the idea just watching the intro that that I made for this, that this whole video would be about Nosferatu. Because even me, for the longest time, I thought that Nosferatu was the first, the original vampire film. And turns out I was wrong. There's at least one, but there might have been two movies, vampire films, prior to Nosferatu. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those. Now, the first one, it's debatable. The only information on it, period, that anybody can find, if you want to even call it that, finding it, is in the Vampire Book, Encyclopedia of the Undead, by, I think it's J. Gordon Milton. And he has a little reference here in the section on Dracula. And it says, I quote, "The first movie that attempted to bring the Dracula novel to the screen may have been a silent film made in Russia, 1920, but no copy has survived." And that's it. That's any mention anywhere of the film is, that's it. Now, there was apparently, wars going on and such, so the movie could have been made and then destroyed. Nobody knows. It's just basically a rumor at this point. Although, there were some people who tried to put a hoax of saying that they found the video. And they put some clip on YouTube, but it's clearly just two, effing idiots just, trying to pull a hoax and being like, "Hey, we found this film, give us all your money." And it's a total fake, and they ought to be ashamed of themselves for trying to pull that on us. But, some people are scumbags, and that's just how it is. Some people, you don't even have to look for this. You can just find vampires in the world just as easily. They do exist. They just don't have fangs. They're just scumbags. Hey, advice for me. You're welcome. The second film that we know existed, we do have a little bit of info to back that up. Not much, but there are still some movie stills, pictures that have survived that prove that this movie did exist. Although it's kind of an odd one, because we know it existed, just don't know what the hell happened to it. It just sort of vanished off the face of the earth shortly after it was released. We don't know if that means that it just had a poor reception and, they just threw it away somewhere and, got lost, destroyed, or maybe somebody still has it. One day maybe we'll find it, maybe someday we won't. But as far as we know, that the movie's lost. The movie was called was in 1921. It was actually, if I recall correctly, 13 months before Nosferatu, and it was called Dracula's Death. Now this is an interesting one actually, because all we have really aside from the pictures is there's a short novella that came out, I think, in 1924, so about 3 years after it was made. This novella circulated, and it's all we have to kind of base the plot on. And some of the pictures we do have sort of, substantiate. That's what I'm looking for. It substantiate the claims of the story. So basically, I mean, I would have liked to see this. I'm you'll see in a second, but I am a bit of a fan of some silent films. This one sounded interesting. It's definitely a unique movie for its time, and I think it would have aged pretty well. I think it would have just gotten a little more interesting. I think due to some of the themes that are in it. So basically, what it is that you got this family, and you get a wife and a husband, older couple, and they got a daughter in her like early 20s or maybe teen years. I'm not sure, but she's a grown up. The mother dies. The father, in his grief, is sent to a mental asylum, which that's kind of the interesting thing there, is because we don't think about it now, but back in the day, you had asylums, mental institutions where basically somebody was grief, somebody didn't fit into society, somebody had a problem. Horror stories abound regarding the topic, but they just threw people in these places and they were there for life. Sometimes families would just drop them off, be like, we can't deal with this person anymore. We don't know what to do, so here you go. And so that's what happens to the father. So while there, this girl, I believe, let me look at the notes here. Yeah, the girl's name was Mary. And so Mary's got a fiance named George. And her and George are celebrating Christmas when they get a letter from the asylum, from the doctor there, saying, you got to come to the asylum. Your father's really not well. He may not survive the night. So they get there as soon as they can. And while there, one of the inmates, now this was kind of interesting because in Dracula, the story, you do have a mental asylum, Dr. Seward's character, and where it's where you meet the character of Renfield in the book. But in this one, where you would think you would meet Renfield, you don't. You meet one of the inmates in there who says he's Dracula and that he's immortal. He's just there for fun, basically. Just hanging out the crazies, because he can just walk around, immune, basically, and everybody would just think that he's crazy and not actually a vampire. Just basically, leave him alone, and he can just do whatever he wants. Which is kind of an interesting idea, and one that, it'd be interesting to see that one remade. They always make remakes. This would be one to remake, just on that plot alone. Just imagine, a vampire, in an asylum, and people just think he's nuts, but he's actually a vampire. Just rampaging around. Nobody, perfect crime, basically, for a vampire. But, I'll get to if he's a vampire or not, a little later on. And that's kind of the interesting part of the story. So, while there, the father dies, unfortunately. And Mary is just grieved over this. The doctor asks her to stay there over the night because just her condition. She's just so too tired from the journey, wiped out from the loss of her father, So she stays there, and she's sleeping. She's woken up by Dracula, kidnapped from him. He takes her away, goes to his castle, and this is where I'd like to see this stuff, the silent film version, because they would be very, very visual. And you can just see the potential that was there in some of these pictures. Just the sets, the costumes, and I'm sure it would have just been just gorgeous to look at. But unfortunately, we'll never know, most likely. And while they're going to have Dracula's wedding. So Mary's supposed to marry Dracula. And get all the vampire brides that he's already got there attending the ceremony. And, Dracula goes to get her and finds out that she's wearing a cross around her neck, and, he's repelled, they're all repelled. She kind of just holds the cross out and makes her escape. Runs through the woods, eventually is found by a family out in the woods, and, kind of sheltered there. She's sick from the whole thing, from the whole experience, just a long, harrowing experience. I'm trying to remember the rest of the plot here. So Dracula finds her there, says that, he's a doctor, and that she's a sick patient escaped from a mental institution, which is a nice twist. Which, I'm just, as I was reading the novella, I could just think, oh my God, this story is so good. I wish, that this still exists so I could watch it, but, this would be a great idea for a remake. Just imagine that, like you're running from this terror, and then the terror says, hey, that mental asylum just, down the road, she's escaped from there. She's a whack job. I'm a doctor, believe me. And, he can use the hypnotic vampire powers to completely convince them that he's really a doctor. So she's kind of screwed in that regard, but she's still got the cross to protect her, which kind of holds him off a bit. And then an actual doctor shows up and is just like, you're not a doctor, I'm a doctor. Dracula's kind of caught red-handed. He leaves. And then, she wakes up. She's still there in the mental institution. It was all a dream. Which is the only part that I was just kind of like, oh, come on, that's a cop-out. But, you know what? It's early part of cinema. I'll allow it. I don't think it had been done to death at that point. So you could get away with it back then. So she's like, oh my God, I've had this nightmare, Dracula, I was having a dream about Dracula in this institution, and that all this stuff happened to me. So they go to see him, and the guards are just like thinking that he had done something to her. So they've come armed just to make sure, he doesn't try anything. And somehow or another, novella doesn't really explain it very well, but he gets a gun, and he hands it to one of the other inmates, who's even crazier than he is. And, you would assume was probably the Renfield character, the really out there one. And so he hands the gun to him, and he says, finally got an opportunity to prove my story's true. He's like, I'm telling you, I'm immortal. I'm Dracula. I can't be killed, so go ahead and shoot me. So the guy goes, okay. Kills Dracula. It's just a guy who's just deranged in the head, thinks he's a vampire, but he's human, and he dies. And then Mary and her fiancé George go and get married, happily ever after, the end. Kind of a weird ending, if that's what they went with. But overall, an interesting take, because it's loosely based on Dracula, but it's not a direct translation of the Dracula novel, which I mentioned in my Dracula review, that even when the plays started coming out, they made changes. I mean, all sorts of different ones. For example, one thing that I read said that the original Dracula play the part of Quincy Morris was actually changed to a woman. So, I mean, little things like that, and that Dracula was made more English, more civilized than he was portrayed in the novel. So, right off the bat, with the first plays, they weren't even exact translations of the book. They took liberties. So when you see the first movie here, it took liberties as well, and it was kind of it's the thing I like about these Dracula stories is they're all different. I mean, it's Dracula, but they're all their own version of Dracula, and that's what keeps it fresh and interesting, and why it still exists to this day. I mean, some tried to be close, but that was later on. But even the ones that were trying to be serious all have their differences as well. So, there we have the first vampire movie for you there, Dracula's Death, and there he is, the first Dracula. And a little interesting note, the director, guy named hopefully I don't butcher this because Hungarian, and the movie was made in Hungary, but so I don't really speak that kind of language, so maybe butchering the dialect a bit, but director's name was Carly Lahathay. I think that's how you say it. It's Lajthay, but I'm assuming the J is pronounced as an H. So Lahathay or Lajthay. Your guess is as good as mine. But he was also an actor, and he was in a movie, which the only thing I could find, I don't know what the English translation is, but it's Nazdal, made in 1917, and it had this guy in it called Bela Lugosi, who also was one of the Draculas in the play version. So, this guy's name apparently supposed to mean something. I mean, I don't know if he did anything after that, but I just find it interesting that, the first Dracula movie had, kind of ties with the plays, which is kind of interesting. Actually, people from both worlds knew each other. As to whether or not any of them went on to do anything else, like this Bela Lugosi guy, I guess we'll just have to wait and see.